So what I want to do is a sort of baseline lecture tonight, and we'll follow this up next week with the historical background, is just think a little bit about what the state does. What is the scope of public policy that we're talking about? Some of this, will be familiar to those of you who've had elementary, high school or university level civics. Some of you are from other fields and might not have had that, so I want to have a sort of baseline, or set a sort of baseline of knowledge. If we think about the American state, we need to go back to the sort of foundations of what we would call modern liberalism. And when you use a term like liberalism before the 20th century, it doesn't mean what we usually use it to mean today. Liberalism simply refers, in a sense, to liberty. Liberty from, kings and despots and that sort of thing, to freedom. And the foundation of that comes out of 18th century political philosophy, most famously Thomas Hobbes, John Locke, and Jean-Jacques Rousseau, whose work in the 18th century was, in a sense, a reaction to European events of the time, developing a new sort of political philosophy, which over time would be sort of earn the generic term of modern liberalism. The core idea behind, this fairly diverse and often argumentative work is that some sort of political organization, some sort of collective organization, is necessary to avoid what Hobbes would have called a state of nature. That is, without political institutions of any kind, people will just kill each other. In Hobbes' famous formulation, life would be nasty, brutish, and short. Locke's view, which is a little bit different, he thought that people would be free, but in constant danger, because there's no intervening political institution, there's no legal institution to protect them from their neighbors or their competitors. And Rousseau, who had a higher opinion of human nature, thought that people were innately moral, nevertheless felt that without collective political institutions, without those sort of background agreements, that life would be ruled by sort of intense and short-sighted competition, by instinct and self-preservation. And of course, all of this arises, all of this theorizing comes about at a moment of very sort of dramatic political change in the Western world. The collapse or the challenge to monarchies embodied by, for example, the French Revolution, the collapse of the economic system of feudalism, the spreading of European empires, and of course the signature event for our purposes, the founding of the United States of America, the invention of new society. And in some respects, given the timing of the American Revolution, it becomes, the sort of test tube for these European ideas, in which the Founding Fathers were, of course, deeply steeped. The basic idea that comes out of this work, and that's written into the sort of our founding documents, is the idea of a social contract, of a voluntary agreement between citizens. Basically, it's an agreement to give up certain freedoms in exchange for protection from others. Now, in Hobbes, in his book Leviathan, his argument was for a benevolent dictatorship. He wanted strong political authority. Everyone agrees to do what the dictator says, and everyone will be happy. The social order, in other words, needed that kind of heavy hand. But Rousseau and Locke and others, the founders of modern liberal political theory, started playing with a different kind of notion of sort of voluntary agreement, of representative government. The idea that this social contract should rest on mutual agreement and that the controlling authority was not a benevolent dictator, but a set of rules that everyone had agreed to. And this is the idea that gets sort of embodied in the founding documents, in the Declaration of Independence and others. The first part of this argument was that people enter into the agreement, into the social contract willingly. So Locke argued, for example, if man in the state of nature is free, why will he part with his freedom? And his answer is that nature, however free, is full of fears and continual dangers. It's not without reason that he seeks out, that is man, and is willing to join in society with others for the mutual preservation of their lives, liberties, and estates. Or, in the words of the Declaration of Independence, this idea of the pursuit of safety and happiness. Also key to these ideas was the notion of consent. That is, you didn't set this up sort of on a one-time basis and then walk away from it, but people needed to constantly agree to the baseline agreement and had to have the means to do that. So that, again, from the Declaration, whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, you need a way of abolishing it. You know, and that can be as simple as some sort of electoral system, which is, in fact, what developed. The second insight here was that the benefits of joining together in this way, of establishing a social contract, would exceed the cost. Everyone recognized that you're giving something up. You know, the freedom to do whatever you want. But the argument developed in this period was that citizens, when they gave this up, this absolute freedom, would nevertheless get something more in return. That the benefits would exceed the costs. And this is embodied in the Declaration, in the idea that in securing these rights, government are instituted among men, deriving their powers from the consent of the governed. So it only worked if all of this was mutually agreed upon. You know, and in Rousseau's argument, famously, was it would make everyone a better citizen, because they'd know what the rules are, they'd behave differently, they'd have more respect for their fellow citizens. So the passage, as Rousseau saw it, from a state of nature, which is sort of competitive and nasty, to a civil state of society, would actually change the way in which people thought about their lives, the way in which they acted. And all of this would, again, confer general benefits, which, as the Constitution famously argued, included justice, tranquility, general welfare, blessings of liberty. Any questions? Okay, all of this was, you know, very novel and very innovative, but it wasn't without its problems, many of which, you know, we continue to wrestle with today. The first of these problems is what political philosophers has characterized as the starting point, or the original position. However inventive you are about inventing new political institutions, you're never doing it from an absolutely neutral starting point. You're not working on a blank slate. And so you're creating these new institutions in a context where some people have more money than others, some people have more political power than others. And so it's very difficult to imagine, in the context of the American Revolution or elsewhere, a way in which this would be done with a true respect for absolute equality among citizens. There's going to be winners and losers. And again, the American Revolution is a good example because the founding documents, the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, conceived of institutions and rules which made people substantially more free than they had been under colonial rule, but were also designed to protect the Founding Fathers from the threat of mob rule. Right? They didn't want wide open democracy in which, with one person, one vote, in which their power would be overturned. And this is one reason why the United States created, such a complicated and hybrid nature of government with elaborate separation of powers. So the Senate turns over every 6 years, and the House turns over every 2 years, and a lot of authorities deferred to the local level. Simply because if you had, elections all the time and could get rid of a government completely, you wouldn't have any of that background stability. So even in inventing a system of, for the time, startling equality, it made a difference that some people had a better position at the starting point than others. The second challenge, of course, is how you manage that consent of the government over time. I mean, it's easy to see in the abstract how you can say, well, let's make some rules, everyone agrees to the rules, now we're fine. But how do you change the rules? How do you deal with a different set of citizens a generation later? You need to have some sort of system of constantly reinventing or ratifying that consent of the governed. So you need some sort of system of representation, like an electoral system. You need some sort of procedures for how you change the rules. For example, in the American system, it's much harder to change the Constitution than it is to, to pass a new law about, helmets for mopeds or something like that. And of course, in managing consent, you also have to think how you're going to manage dissent. Because you're talking about a system of majority rule, and at least between elections, you're going to have people who, fundamentally disagree with what the government's doing. How do you manage that? And this is dramatically true in our own time. If you think about the sort of overlapping concerns of Tea Party conservatives and Occupy Wall Street folks as, fundamental sort of fonts of political dissent. And we'll talk about these in more detail later in the class. The next problem has to do with scale. And this is a particularly challenging problem in the American context. Rousseau and other European thinkers were quite aware of the fact that they were designing or thinking about political institutions for relatively small, unitary European states. 100 miles from top to bottom. But in an expansive setting like the United States, with many political jurisdictions, and for most of American history, rather, some of those jurisdictions at the eastern end of the country are much more well-developed than those at the western end of the country. So we have territories becoming states, constant expansion across the western frontier. So this is a practical problem of governing a big country. It's also a sort of philosophical problem because there are fundamental arguments to be made for very local governance, because that puts you closest to those in power, who tend to be your neighbors. It means that you can have the equivalent of town hall meetings. It means that you can sort of manage the consent of the government in very transparent ways. But alongside that, there's the argument, equally powerful, that at least on some issues you need the efficiency of government at the national level. You know, you can't have every city council in the United States, for example, regulating broadcasting or deciding railroad rates. So you need to match the scale of state power, local, state, national, in this setting, with the kind of things that you're trying to accomplish. And there's always, again, that tug-of-war between, you know, federal uniformity and local standards, something we see playing out in the 20th century in areas like education, schooling. You know, everything from the segregation or desegregation of schools in the South to No Child Left Behind is a fundamental tension between local, state, and federal governments over an important policy issue. And, you know, it's, as we'll explore later in the course, this question of scale lies at the root of much of the objection to the Affordable Care Act, with the argument that we'll talk a little bit more next day, that it's the argument on the part of some that it's simply not allowed under the Constitution to force people to buy health insurance, that that's a violation of the separation of powers between state, or the distinction of powers between state and federal government. Even among federal or federated governments, the United States is somewhat unique. Unlike settings like Australia or Canada, also big settings with sort of provincial or state jurisdictions as well, the United States is set up to reserve most fundamental powers to the state. And so only specified powers under the Constitution go to the national government. So those battles tend to be, and again, we'll talk more about this next week, tend to be much more bitter. The next question, of course, is what's the scope of state power? You know, and this is simply another way of you know, restating that old aphorism, you know, the government that governs best is the government that governs least. As you can see, you know, by the phrases in italics here, the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence were not that helpful about actually specifying what the government should do. I mean, these are pretty abstract notions. How do you legislate tranquility? And of course, you know, it changes fundamentally over time. And then the final point I would make here is that, you know, this basic organization of a social contract, of how people relate to their governing institution, is just one of a number of competing ways in which societies are organized. There are other institutions, religious institutions, family institutions, economic institutions, which are also competing in some respect for these powers. So, taking it, you know, down a level from this high abstraction, let's focus a little more on what the primary interest in this room is going to be for the rest of the semester. Much of what we're talking about has to do not with just the political system, but with a combination of a particular political system and a particular economic system. And that's why people, you know, generally talk about the American system as one of democratic capitalism. It's not just democracy, it's not just capitalism, it's both. And the overlap and the juxtaposition is extremely important. You know, one way people often look at this is with these kinds of indexes. So The Economist magazine, for example, does this every year. They do an index of democracy, where you have, you know, your classic full democratic countries. I've just put a selection of them here, and you know, in the order in which they rank: Finland, Canada, the United States. And, you know, then you have a few that political observers would call sort of hybrids, in which the democratic institutions are somewhat flawed. Often these are countries which have democratic institutions on paper, but suffer rampant corruption or something like that. And then you have countries which are, you know, so Cuba, China, others, which are fundamentally authoritarian. That is, they don't have strong democratic institutions. So you have this index of, sort of from unfree to free. But we're talking not just about politics, but about economics as well. So you can do the same thing for economic freedom. And so the Heritage Foundation, for example, does this. And so I've arranged, you pick the same countries, and they fall in roughly the same order. You have the hybrids in the middle. You have the very closed markets at this end. Interestingly, you have countries like China, which are very authoritarian in the form of government, but which have a lot of free markets at the fringes. And so again, you can conceive of this as a sort of unfree to free scale. And this would include, closed or planned economies like the old Soviet Union, these, hybrids like China, and more democratic systems, which would include a setting like Finland, which I would call democratic socialism, and a setting like the United States, which I would call sort of democratic capitalism, where there's both markets and political institutions are fundamentally open. And then, of course, my big background point here is that you have to think about these in combination. And so if we arrange these on a 2x2 graph, with unfree at this end and at the bottom and freedom up there, you're generally looking for, some move in this direction. You want to be in that upper quadrant. And this is another way of thinking about the complaints or concerns or anxieties about actions that our government might take. Think of the ways in which the Affordable Care Act, again, to come back to that example, is often characterized as violating this sense of basic freedoms and pulling us in one direction back down this arrow. The American system, then, is best characterized by this combination of free market institutions and free political institutions. So on the one hand, you have a political system with, at least by the modern era, universal suffrage, a representative system government, and basic civil liberties. And that sits alongside, and as we'll argue, in some tension with, an economic system which is based on a different set of values, on private property, on private markets, and on private control over investment. And of course, much of the heat and light in our political debate has to do with the relationship between these two. When do economic rights and political rights collide? And so, the Occupy Wall Streeters, for example, have a fundamental argument that individual rights are being trammeled by unfettered economic power. Just as Tea Party conservatives have an argument that individual economic and political freedoms are being trammeled by unfettered government power. Much of the tension arises out of the fact that you have a political system that's premised, whose fundamental premise is equality, and an economic system whose fundamental premise is not equality. That is, you don't expect equality out of markets. You expect some people to succeed and some to fail. Then the question, and we'll come back to this in a moment, is what does the political system do about that? There are, in this sense, a lot of similarities a lot of complementary aspects of the economic and the political system, and a lot of tension. Certainly, we should recognize the argument made by, Adam Smith and others that open markets sustain open political institutions, and vice versa. That's what was one of the central arguments of American foreign policy through much of the first half of the 20th century, that they were exporting free markets, and in the process were also exporting democracy. So markets are seen in this view to sort of sustain political freedoms, coordinating exchange among individuals, distributing resources efficiently, creating incentives for innovation. Another way of thinking about it is that a system of democratic capitalism is not just capitalism, because it has these democratic institutions attached to it. So that regardless of how much money you have, for example, you do have the same formal political rights. Workers, the unemployed, the very poor, are much better off under democratic capitalism than they would be under capitalism alone. Because your political system, in a sense, is democratizing the market. But just as importantly, it's not just democracy either, that the market shapes democratic outcomes. It brings market resources to bear on the way in which the political system works. There are a number of ways to think about this. One is what I would call the resource constraint. That is, democracy is constrained or shaped by the fact that it's paired with a market in which outcomes are not equal. So it's one thing to say that all Americans have the same right to private property. But clearly, Bill Gates and I are not in a position to enjoy that right to the same degree, because resources make a difference. All Americans have the same basic right to free speech. But of course, Rupert Murdoch and I don't, in practice, have the same access to venues of speech, because resources make a difference. And this, of course, and Bob Edgar will talk about this later in the course, is the core disagreement at the heart of the Citizens United decision that opened up the political arena to really sort of unlimited advertising, sort of non-electoral advertising by super PAC. The argument, of course, is that it's a form of free speech. So the markets shape political outcomes because having resources matter. They also shape outcomes because they shape the way in which political demands are made, what I would call the demand constraint. The more you have invested, the bigger your stake, the more likely it is that you're going to be deeply involved in the political process. We have a society in which much of the basic organization of economic activity, where money's invested, where you get employed, that sort of thing, those decisions are made by the market. There's a commitment to the notion that markets do that well, do that efficiently. And so governments have to defer to markets and defer to those who are in control of investment and employment decisions. It's important to keep them happy. This is often understood as the importance of having a business-friendly environment. You know, whether you're talking about Iowa City or the state of Iowa or the entire country. You need to encourage that investment. That shapes, in other words, your political choices. This occurs in little ways, in tax policy, in labor policy. It's really, you know, it's what we see playing out in different ways is, you know, the old saying that what's good for GM is good for the country. That really is the way a lot of political decisions are made, because it's fundamentally true. If you defer those decisions to the market, you need to make sure that the markets work well. You know, and it occurs in big ways as well, as we saw with the bailouts, the TARP program, the rescue of the auto industry, the notion that some economic actors are too big to fail. Think of all the ways in which local units of government, states, cities, counties, slave away to try and attract business investment, even if it just means moving Von Maur across town. And think of the ways that we, especially in the U.S., rely upon markets to distribute what in other countries are more basic social goods. We run healthcare through employment, for example. So for all these reasons, markets are very important and act as this sort of demand constraint on public policy and political choices. Narrowing this even a little bit further, I think it's very helpful for a particular range of policy to think about the function of the state, well, at least one of the core functions of the state, under democratic capitalism, as managing market failures. So if you have a political system in which you defer a lot of decisions, you defer much of the distribution of employment and resources to the market, then much of your political energy, as I've suggested at a couple of points, is making sure that those markets work smoothly. And one way to think about that is to think about the political role, the role of public policy, as simply stepping in when markets fail. And that failure can take a number of different forms. It's generally true, widely recognized, for example, that markets do not do a very good job of providing what we call public goods. Clean water, street lights, roads. Public goods are, as the name suggests, goods that are of a broad public benefit, but they're also defined by the fact that it's often very difficult to get people to pay for them. So we can agree, for example, as we leave this room, that it's nice to have streetlights as we go home. But it's a little bit hard to imagine how the market would provide for those streetlights. How would they charge us for walking underneath them, for example? Streetlights are one of the most common examples that economists use of a public good. It's simply easier to tax everybody and put up the streetlight. You know, roads are a more complicated version because you do have more discretionary ways of paying for roads, like with gas tax. You can have toll roads, for example. But like other aspects of basic infrastructure, think of the streets outside this library, it's as a rule easier to collect from a broad group of people on the assumption that they're all going to benefit from the roads in some way and just build them. It's much easier than buying and selling roads with, to the people who will actually use them. These, then, are public goods. Something that markets are slow to provide, and so stepping in to correct that failure that hesitance, there's a role for public policy. The second, there's 37 of these if you're keeping a numbered list. No, I'm just kidding. The second characteristic market failure is what economists would call an information failure. There are obviously, numerous points of market exchange at which it's important that buyers and sellers have certain information. But buyers and sellers may have the incentive to hide that information from one another. A classic example, being the marketing of snake oil medicine, which is over time regulated by the state. And so you have this elaborate system in terms of the sort of health or therapeutic claims that you can make on the part of a drug. There's the example of basic nutrition labeling, the idea that consumers should have ready access to that information. That in a system of market exchange, it's too much to expect that someone is going to look up how many calories are in their hamburger every time they buy one. That are going to go onto the FDA website and find out exactly, what's going on with this medicine. And so as a way of overcoming those failures of the market to provide adequate information, there's a regulatory role for public policy. And so this captures another sort of tangle of characteristic policy. The next two that I'll touch on really relate directly to the core tension between democracy and capitalism. Markets are generally very efficient in distributing goods and distributing them efficiently, finding a price at which they can best be sold at. But the efficiency of markets tends to break down if there are not enough buyers or if there are not enough sellers. The classic example is the anxiety about monopoly. And a good example, of course, is the attention paid to the Microsoft empire in our own time, just as it was to the sort of Standard Oil or some of the big industrial trusts in the early part of the 20th century. These concentrations of economic power are seen as dangerous for two reasons. One, they prevent the market from operating properly. If you have two companies selling, a basic operating system, for example, they will compete in order to provide a best product at the cheapest price. But if that market is dominated through technological patents, through agreements with computer suppliers, however it's accomplished by one seller, then you no longer have the markets clearing prices and providing that sort of protection of competition. So the markets will no longer provide those efficient outcomes. The second danger is that undue concentrations of economic power will spill over into the political system. And that's the concern, expressed in this editorial cartoon, or expressed by, the We Are the 99-cent protest, or 99% protests, rather, that we see today. The assumption is not that, big banks and hedge fund managers have just succeeded in the market. The assumption is that they've amassed enough economic resources to distort the political system in their favor in order to cement their market success, with, low tax rates or less regulation, however you want to put it. So again, public policy, in this view, has a role in addressing, either in order to make markets work or in order to prevent political corruption, these concentrations of economic power. The flip side of this, of course, is a complete absence of economic power, inequality, poverty. Again, very much on people's minds today. There's clearly a role for public policy in addressing the inability of the market to make everybody rich. But not just to make everybody rich, to make everybody self-sustaining. So politics, public policy has always stepped in to deal with stretches of unemployment, to deal with those who, for one reason or another, just drop out of the bottom of the labor market. Think of the arc, for example, of welfare policy, which was inaugurated early in the 20th century in order to make it possible for single mothers not to work. That is, the public policy goal was to get those women out of the workforce because they should be at home with their children. In that early 20th century view, a woman at work or a mother at work was a poor reflection on her family, on her husband. Later in the 20th century, of course, we turned that reasoning upside down, and the argument is that if you're receiving welfare benefits, well, you damn well better work, or get to work quickly. So you have the sort of welfare to work push. Because there's a sort of changing mood about the role of government benefits. But nevertheless, at either end of that spectrum, you have public policy taking a stand on the problem of inequality generated by the market. One way to think about this is the policy imperative to simply provide a floor underneath the operation of market, under which people will not fall. So you have food stamps and reduced fee school lunches and your minimum wage. You don't allow the market to make all of those decisions. Child labor laws, a long list of basic protection. Two more. Another characteristic market failure is what economists call externalities. This is, an economist term for what it's easier to think of as just the sort of side effects of market activity. There are things created by market activity which buyers and sellers are able to avoid. The classic example is pollution. You buy and sell, the power produced by a coal-fired plant. You buy and sell the steel made in a foundry. But no one, neither the producer of the good nor the buyer of the good, is paying for the cost on the nation's air, its rivers, these sort of external side effects of production. Another example of an externality is when a plant closes and people are thrown out of work. It's just the market at work, right? I can't make money, making cars in this town anymore, so I'm going to close my plant and I'm going to go somewhere else where it's cheaper to make cars. That's the market at work. But of course, that community is left behind with high levels of unemployment, with this what economists would call an externality of the plant closing. It's not the role of those who are buying the cars, nor necessarily the role of those who are making the cars, to pick up those costs, except when public policy compels them to do so. So you need to provide severance benefits, or you need to contribute to an unemployment insurance fund, that sort of thing. And just as we have on this side, the sort of regulatory prescriptions, the Clean Water Act, the Clean Air Act, which try to reimpose some of those external costs on producers. The final sort of characteristic market failure that I would identify here is just short-sightedness. Because markets are driven by a profit motive, market actors are more interested in returns on investment, on wages and compensation in the short run than they are in the long run. A classic example of this, of course, is the bust of the housing bubble. entirely driven by a home mortgage finance system in which it was very easy to make money by flipping mortgage-backed securities very quickly. In, I would argue, widespread awareness of the fact that at some point it would end. And so the role for public policy, of course, is to try and restrain that short-sightedness, to regulate financial markets, for example, in such a way that encourage people to take a longer view, which might be less lucrative in terms of profits, but is more politically acceptable in terms of longer-term stability and security. So the core role, and we'll spin this out as we look at a variety of topics over the course of the semester, the core role of the state under democratic capitalism is to manage the market, and particularly to step in when the market fails, when the markets falter, or when markets simply fail to provide something that a stable and secure society needs. And these are the sort of characteristic forms. And you can think of, numerous examples under any one of these. So we have a system marked by shared responsibility between market institutions on the one hand and political institutions on the other for basically running things. Each half of that equation influences the other, right? Money shapes politics. Politics sets the rules for the market. And what follows from that, I would argue, is that much political attention is drawn to the task of making the market work and addressing its failures. Now, I will not pretend, and this will be another major theme in the course, that there's any consensus, even remotely, about how we do that. In fact, at our current historical moment, I would say the disagreements over how we accomplish that are as bitter as they've ever been. There's a wide gap between the way in which people across the political spectrum view those fundamental problems. What's the boundary between economic and political control? If you have these market failures, at what point does the state step in, if at all? I mean, some would argue that you just allow the market failures to play out. But there is no too big to fail, that eventually the market will sort its problems out. Milton Friedman, the sort of grandfather of modern American economic conservatism, argued, the main and only function of government must be to protect our freedom from enemies outside our gates and from our fellow citizens, so the classic sort of Rousseauian view, to preserve law and order, you need to know where your property ends and where mine begins, to enforce private contracts, and to foster competitive markets. But for Friedman, that was about it. He didn't have much patience for interventions, minimum wage, collective bargaining rights, welfare state. He felt those were violations, would create inefficiencies in the market. So there's a big spectrum from those who see the market as sort of guaranteeing basic property, or see politics as guaranteeing basic property rights and then getting out of the way, and those who see a much more elaborate role for government in putting floors under wages and in regulating markets and dampening the baser instincts of the economic system. Much of this disagreement rests on, how people view markets. How efficient are they? One of the common ways, if we look across the political intervention of the 20th century, one of the common disagreements can be put this way: are market failures endemic to any market system? That is, do they happen all the time, or are they episodic? Do they just happen occasionally? Well, if they're episodic, got the Great Depression, then your view of the state is sort of like Superman. He swoops in, he corrects the Great Depression, he flies away again, and markets work their magic. But if you view the tendency of markets to fail in that way as something that is not episodic, that is actually endemic, that happens all the time, then your view of the state is not Superman, it's a policeman on the beat. He should be there all the time, enforcing the rules, enforcing the basic standards. Much of the bitterness of current political debate is really about which of those failures we choose to address, and at what cost. One way of looking at the healthcare debate, for example, is to appreciate that some people see the inability of many Americans, 50 million at last count, to get health insurance as a market failure. And so public policy steps in. Others see that as just a natural market outcome. And so the argument then is that the state should not step in. Another sort of example of this, of stepping in some places and not in others, of course, is in the whole flap about the bailout. Because, of course, you had some of the largest economic institutions getting elaborate government handouts, but many smaller concerns, just going out of business. So why is it that some are considered too big to fail? And why are others allowed to fail? Where does public policy enter when the market fails? And of course, as this slide is meant to suggest, every time on whatever scale one of those decisions made, it boils down to a conflict in people's notions of where their rights begin and end. One of the most powerful notions of this is the idea of the resistance in American political culture of the idea that your tax dollars would be spent on a program for someone else. The American political system has developed in such a way that much more so than almost any other democratic capitalist country, we rely on discretionary taxes. So a Medicare payroll tax pays for Medicare. A Social Security payroll tax pays for Social Security. You don't use general revenue taxes. Local property tax pays for education. And so people see, oh, that's my taxes, that's what I get out of it. This is why, you get people at a Tea Party rally holding up a sign that says, get the government hands off my Medicare. Which is, on the surface makes no sense because Medicare is a government program, but because of the way it's paid for, because of the way in which people perceive their relationship to the government, it makes perfect sense. Finally, what enters into this equation, what enters into this debate and the contemporary bitterness of the debate are those background disagreements that we started with about the scale and the scope of state power. So often it's not a disagreement that the state should act, but a question of whether it should be the federal or the state government acting. This is why, for example, Mitt Romney makes the elaborate distinction between what he did in Massachusetts for health care and what Obama has tried to do for the nation for health care. The plans are virtually identical, but Romney, clings, sincerely and insincerely, I think, to the notion that doing it in a state is a fundamentally different thing. And that's a deeply seated notion in American political culture that we see, through the 20th century, through the whole civil rights struggle, and to the present day. Oops. So, just to sum up, these are the basic points. Moving from the big abstraction, what is modern liberalism? Where does our political founding documents come from? Then it's important to recognize that the terms of those are very complicated, that In fact, those founding documents are very vague as to the terms, and much of that is battled out over time. And then what I've tried to do is sort of narrow your attention to a particular sort of subset, a pretty large subset of policies, that those that deal with the contradictions of democratic capitalism, with market failures. And then, of course, that feeds back into the background disagreements and inconsistencies and vagaries of our political system, because there's not much of a consensus as to how you accomplish all of that. Now, much of this will be familiar to you. Much of it will be sort of cast at a level of abstraction, which maybe it's difficult to get your head around for the moment. And so what we will do next week when we pick up this discussion is cover much of the same ground, but by way of a historical discussion, looking at the development of the American state over time and what it does in sort of characteristic political moments in response to the Great Depression, in response to World War II, in response to our current recession. And so we'll take that historical journey next day. That's all I have for tonight. Don't slam your chairs yet. If there's anyone in the room who is not currently enrolled but has an ad slip, come see me, number one. Number two, between now and early next week, go on the ICON site, see what's expected of you in the course, particularly with regard to the sort of weekly discussion sections and feedback. Make sure you have a grasp on that and bring your questions next week. Both post them to ICON and bring them next week. Any questions? Okay.